Hello for everybody. Shalom lekulam. I'm delighted to open the second session for today in the wake of common identity, contemporary literature and art in Germany. And I would like to share with the estimated form a conversation I had with a young German sociologist last month in Berlin. According to his assessment, the German people committed a terrible sin in accepting the Nazi worldview. As a result of this sin, the German people were not only punished severely, but they also admitted their sin publicly and took upon themselves penance. Currently, today, according to the opinion of this sociologist, the German people have completed their punishment and are continuing in their campaign of atonement. As part of this process of atonement, the German people seek to be the most right people in the world, and as such, have adopted only those ideologies and actions whose aims are to establishment of world peace and benefit of entire world. While the man with whom I spoke was himself a pronounced not Christian and not Jew, without religion, on the basis of both his own beliefs and those of his politically view, he did not deny the significant Christian influence on this overview. Indeed, it is through this Christian influence that he also explains his relationship with the State of Israel and especially his relationship with the Jews in Germany. So the question of common identity is a very complex and very interesting issue now in Germany and also in Israel. So we have three speakers today, and you are going to take your notes, and the question will follow our discussion at the end. Our first speaker is Professor Hanni Mittelmann, teaches at the Department of German Literature at the Hebrew University. Her field of research is German Jewish literature from the 19th century to the present. She has published on topics like exile, Jewish identity, and Zionist literature. She is also the editor of the collected work of the Austrian Jewish writer Albert Ehrenstein. Her last book is a monograph of the Zionist writer Sami Grunemann, and the podium is yours.
Microphone, the enemy of the speakers. So I hope, or I think that my paper will give a different perspective or contribute to the perspectives on Jewish identity that we have started to discuss in this morning's session. And I think, though, that my paper will give a more happy upturn note to this discussion. As you now see from the program, it's on humorist literature. The emergence of a Jewish-German entertainment literature, which presents the topic of Jewish identity and culture in a humorous way, is a rather recent phenomenon in the contemporary German book market. We find a plethora of new collections of Jewish jokes like Sechs am Shabbat by Ilan Weiss, I don't have to translate that, Jetzt mal Tachles, die jüdischen Lieblingswitze von Paul Spiegel, the favorite Jewish jokes of Paul Spiegel collected by his daughters Dina and Leonie Spiegel. He was the late president of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland. There are also more academic treatises on the Jewish joke, like No, warum nicht? Der jüdische Witz als Quelle der Lebenskunst. No, why not? The Jewish joke is the source of the art of living, by the Austrian psychotherapist Elisabeth Jupiter. In addition, however, there are also quite a number of semi-autobiographical books and novels which throw a humorous light on the not exactly easy coexistence of Germans and Jews. Some examples are the already mentioned Lena Gorelik, her novel with the impossibly long title Lieber Mischa, der du fast Shlomo Adolf Greenblum geheißen hättest, es tut mir leid, dass ich dir das nicht ersparen konnte, du bist ein Jude. In English, it's just as long. The translation, Dear Mischa, who was almost called Shlomo Adolf Greenblum, I'm sorry that I can't spare you the fact you are a Jew. Or the book by Oliver Pollack, Ich darf das, ich bin Jude, I'm allowed to do this, I'm a Jew. Or from the same author, the book and disc Jud, Süß, Sauer, the show. We also can find any number of books on the market which try to provide humorous instructions to the uneasy German reader regarding how to deal with a Jew if said reader should encounter one in the workplace, at a party, or at the tennis club. According to Michael Wulliger, author of the Book of Etiquette, Der koschere Knigge, trittsicher durch die deutsch-jüdischen Fettnäpfchen. I didn't know how to translate Fettnäpfchen. I translated the kosher Knigge, sure-footed through the German-Jewish mess. Something like that. For a German to meet a Jew presents a statistical possibility of 1 to 400, which is, as he puts it, after all, twice as likely as to win big in the lottery. My goal here is to discuss this type of literature as a reflection of the ongoing reconceptualization of Jewish identity in contemporary Germany by the younger generation of Jews living in Germany. The previous generation of post-World War II German Jewish writers like Henrik Broder, Raphael Seligmann, Doron Rabinowitschi, Lea Fleischmann, Maxim Biller, and so on, and others who burst on the literary scene in Germany and Austria in the 1980s, were the offspring of their traumatized survivor parents. These authors described their life in the land of the murderers of their grandparents and torturers of their parents with satiric wit and biting irony. They saw themselves, as Raphael Seligmann put it, as the grandchildren of Tucholsky, and thus connected to the discursive tradition of sarcastic, ironic Jewish humor which existed in Germany from the time of Heinrich Heine and Ludwig Börne and ended 1933 with Kurt Tucholsky. This type of humor, which was revived by these writers in the 1980s, was frivolous, aggressive, and controversial. It was an oppositional humor, sharp-edged, with wicked points directed against a Germany that they deemed to be unredeemable. It was a literature which expressed a deep-seated alienation and distrust of Germany, reflected in titles like Dies ist nicht mein Land, eine Jüdin verlässt die Bundesrepublik, by Lea Fleischmann, This is not my country, a Jewess leaves Germany. In contrast, the books by the new young generation of German Jewish writers reflect a Mentalitätswechsel, a change of mentality, as Wulliger terms it in an article bearing the title, Aus das Trauma, the trauma is over. This new generation has keine Angst vor Deutschland, is no longer afraid of Germany, as the title of a book by the historian Michael Wolfson announces. This book was published in 1990 and proclaimed a Wende, a turning point, both in German mentality and in Jewish self-perception. This second and third generation of German Jewish writers, as represented by Gorelik, Pollack, Vladimir Kaminer, Wertlieb, Aryeh Shalikar, Vanessa Vogel, and others, is somewhat removed from the traumatic events of the past. For them, the Holocaust is a fact of German history, which they know about from the stories of their grandparents. It is a part of their lives, just as it is a part of the lives of their German contemporaries. But this historical knowledge of the past is not burdened with fear or hatred or attribution of guilt. It does not influence their self-image or their self-perception. Thanks to this new generation, Germany's Jews, so Wolliger in his article, "The Trauma is Over," have grown out of the role as victims. This certainly accounts for their emerging humorous self-representation and their relaxed view of German-Jewish relations. An equally important reason that might account for this type of attitude is that these young Jewish writers have a migratory background. They come from the former Soviet Union or from Israel, England, or America, and have developed a different take on identity and the relation of their own culture to their host culture. This generation, with its multiple cultural, national, and linguistic identities, no longer knows the cognitive search for a unified identity, which was so typical for modernity. Rather, it celebrates a postmodern pluralism and the freedom of a hybrid identity, which has developed from its Russian, Israeli, English, or American identities. The experience of liminality and cultural hybridity is part of their lives. But no longer is there the melancholy of torn identities as existed among German Jews before World War II, and also among the second post-war generation whose loyalties were torn between Israel and Germany. This youngest generation displays confidently its affinities for different cultures. As children of post-colonialism and globalization, they do not deny their ethnicity, as the titles of the aforementioned books prove. They make visible the cultural differences that exist, but at the same time create new cultural models of a transcultural identity that both confirm and dissolve das eigene und das Fremde. Using the title of an article by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur as a reference, von der Trauerarbeit zur Übersetzung, from the labor of mourning to translation, one could say that this young generation of Jewish writers has indeed moved from Trauerarbeit, from the labor of mourning, in which the previous post-Holocaust generation had to engage, to the labor of transcultural translation. Thanks to their multiple cultural backgrounds, they have become mediators between the cultures and are attempting to create the equivalence of the non-identical by the narration of their own histories. Their narrative identity is no longer characterized by the Ipse, the identity of the self, but by Bewegtheit, by changeability and mobility, and by exchangeability. The exchange of cultures, or rather the translation of cultures, as Paul Ricoeur puts it, becomes the new goal. These young writers want to create equivalences, but not identities. They create comparisons between what seemingly cannot be compared. Their writings point to the undeniable phenomenon of human plurality, but also aim to mediate between the plurality of cultures and the unity of humanity, as Ricoeur puts it. The changed historical and social circumstances in Germany have affected a change in German mentality and the self-perception of the Jews living in Germany. This is also due to the influence of American culture on post-World War II Germany. Writers like Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Mordecai Richler, and others, but also the Hollywood films of Woody Allen, which represent the American Jewish tradition of humor, have found their way onto the German cultural scene. Moreover, and above all, TV sitcoms like Alf, The Nanny, Seinfeld, Roseanne appeared in German living rooms in the mid-1980s with the start of German commercial television. Here, Germans were made familiar with the American melting pot vision of society. The structure of strangers are welcome that formed the basis of these American Jewish sitcoms and soaps suggested that the other does not have to be viewed as threatening. Rather, the other can have an enriching and humanizing influence on a state society set in its way, as, for instance, the figures of the alien Alf, as well as the figure of the nanny prove. Both figures add a bit more color to the conventional lives of the families of which they have become part, and provide these families with new perspectives on life and living. These humorous and positive representations of the alien also influenced the young Jews who were growing up in Germany at that time and were looking for models with whom to identify. For the previous post-war generation of young Jews, it was the Israeli Jew who had become the shining example for a desirable Jewish identity. He soon became deconstructed by writers like Raphael Seligman and Maxim Biller and others. Now the American Jew and his role in American society came into view. One became acquainted with the historically grown social constellation of integrative American identity politics, which was fundamentally open towards immigrants and invited them to participate in the creation of a common American culture. From this attitude emerged the self-confident Jewish American self-image of which Jews living in Germany could only dream. The image of the American Jew, which was transmitted by the literature, sitcoms, and movies produced in post-World War II America, was described by Sander Gilman as follows. I cite, "America is fun for the Jews. They become powerful, win Nobel Prizes, and engage in the building of cultural institutions such as video archives of the Holocaust. They are smart Jews, but not tough Jews. They have it easy. They are superficial and not engaged in the reconstitution of a new Jewish culture, for Jewish culture in America has become mainstream." America is seen by the young Jews living in Germany as a place of tolerance and acceptance of minorities, of Jews and artists. It has become the model for this generation, which started to demand the implementation of the American vision of an integrative society. The experience of America helped these young Jews who lived in Germany and Austria acquire a new self-image and a new literary program. What they learned from the American Jewish experience was that the entrance into mainstream society can be won via laughter, by the employment of the famous Jewish humor, which in America had become part of the American mainstream culture, just as jazz had turned from a black music to an American music. Modeled after the American Jewish example, entertaining humor seems to have become an important discursive voice of the Jewish minority group in Germany. Through laughter, one tries to establish oneself as a member of a society from which one otherwise would be excluded. The humor engaged in by this young generation is not aggressive and alienating like the satirical and sarcastic wit employed by the previous generation, which in its essence was intolerant towards everything German. The newest type of humor is much more accepting and also socially more acceptable. It is an inclusive type of humor that programmatically aims at ending the isolation in which the Jewish community has lived since after the war and encourages to vie for acceptance and integration. This inclusive and conciliatory type of humor, however, has nothing to do with assimilatory self-dissolution. Unlike the pre-war generation of German Jews, this young post-Holocaust generation no longer sees it necessary to pay this price for social acceptability. It wants acceptance and not tolerance, as proclaimed by the title of the book that was mentioned before by Lena Gorelik, the young writer who immigrated to Germany from Russia at the age of 11. I'm reading just the English title. You really speak an excellent German. Why I no longer want to be grateful for being allowed to live here and why tolerance is not enough. By narrating themselves and their own culture, these young Jews living and writing in Germany attempt to achieve acknowledgement and acceptance of their own uniqueness, as well as to create a sense of similarities, of Ähnlichkeiten. Through humorous representation of the alien and foreign, modeled after the American Jewish sitcoms, these writers attempt to make this alien accessible and take away the aura of a foreign threat. Thus, the sitcom figure Alf, with whom you hopefully are all familiar with, became an important identificatory figure for Oliver Pollock in his youth. From this, he writes, big-nosed cousin with the body covering sidelocks, Pollock learned that one can stage the alien, and specifically the Jewish alien, who was and is always eyed by Germans with suspicion, in an engaging way. By undermining xenophobic views and dogmatic thinking with humor, the unknown and alien start to lose their threatening aspects and can even be experienced as endearing and amiable. The stand-up comedy shows of Oliver Pollock, which are built on this concept, always play before sold-out audiences. I never got any tickets to them. This seems to prove that this approach is somewhat effective. The new type of humorous self-representation also aims to stress the commonality of humanity and the similarity of the different. This is what, for instance, Wolliger wants to impress upon the German reader with his little etiquette book. Right at the beginning, he states that the German reader will discover that he shares with the Jew many more traits than he would suspect. And now comes my translation, which is not as funny, I am afraid, as the German original. So, soccer, he writes, Wolliger writes, is more interesting to him, the Jew, than the situation in Gaza. He's interested more in the performance qualities of his car than in the problem of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, overcoming the past. He prefers listening to ABBA rather than to klezmer music. And rather than the Talmud, he reads Kicker, the football magazine. Therefore, Wolliger recommends to the German reader, in case he should meet a Jew, he should not get on the Jew's nerves by telling him how distressed he was after the visit of the Holocaust Memorial, or impart to him his clever insights into the Middle East conflict. Wolliger also recommends not inquiring about the details of the laws of kashrut, which Jews most probably do not know anyhow. After all, he writes, no Catholic would be happy to get into a debate on transubstantiation while he's drinking his beer. These young writers write from a place of self-confidence and loving acceptance of their ethnic background. They no longer know the Jewish self-hatred of previous generations, which expressed itself so often in self-criticism, as we know from Freud. A case in point are, again, the autobiographical novels by Lena Gorelik, in which she describes, with loving self-irony, the positive, but also some of the more grotesque sides of Jewish culture and traditions. The communal structures of Jewish ethnicity, which were still the target of snide criticism by the previous generation of Jewish writers, who depicted them as oppressive and repressive, are now portrayed as a civilizing, protective structure. Even the Yiddische Mame, the object of vicious attacks by writers like Seligman, is now seen not as the source of castration anxieties, but rather as the source of strength and an individual sense of value. Assimilation is no longer a topic in this literature. It rather deconstructs the German Leitkultur, whose often grotesque aspects form the background for the descriptions of some equally grotesque aspects of Jewish culture. By making their own culture the object of satire, these young writers free themselves from the ethnic stereotypes imposed on them by others, but they also free themselves from the restrictions and taboos of their own culture. This type of self-representation both destabilizes and transcends anti-Semitic prejudices, but it also negates the philo-Semitic projections that have created the idealized folkloric images of the Jew, which have become common in post-war Germany. The parodist subversion of such stereotypes points to the fragility of the construction of the image of the Jew, but also demands and confirms the common norms of a civil society regarding the other. The humorous entertainment produced by these young Jewish writers is in the main conciliatory, but clearly also displays a disciplinary aspect of which Henri Bergson speaks in his theory of humor. The background to this humor is, just like in traditional Jewish ghetto humor, the experience of rejection and exclusion by the dominant society. And therefore, as in traditional Jewish humor, the aim is to neutralize the enemy through laughter, to bring conscious or half-conscious prejudices which are deeply rooted in the collective folklore of German society into the open and reveal their ludicrousness and their absurdity. Thus, in his chapter, Points for the First Encounters with a Jew, Wolliger disarms some of the more common stereotypes about Jews. And I quote, again, my translation. Mr. Bleiberg, who has been introduced to you at the birthday party of a colleague, who has advised you already beforehand, he is a Jew, but very nice, might possibly disappoint you. He neither wears a black hat nor sidelocks. If he has a beard, then he probably sports one of the fashionable 3-day variation. He speaks perfect German without a Yiddish accent. He also does not carry an Uzi. Actually, he looks totally normal. You really don't look it is not a good way to start a conversation with this Jew. The laughter elicited here is based on norms of civil thinking and behavior, which excludes those who won't abide by them. It aims to create a solidarity within the group that can laugh together and excludes those who do not join in the laughter from membership in a civilized, liberal, and humanistic society. The goal of this laughter is, to speak with Walter Benjamin, die Vernichtung dessen, was das Humane bedroht, the destruction of all that which threatens the humane. By this humanizing and creative type of humor, these young writers open way of communication between Germans and Jews. They turn fear into laughter and thus achieve a social potency which is usually denied to the Jew or attributed to him in an exaggerated way. The phallic power of the word, as Lacan puts it, dismantles hierarchies and takes the mastery of discourse, the power of this definition, back from the dominant society. This seemingly harmless Jewish entertainment literature is, after all, not so harmless as it might appear. It is entertaining, but it is not harmless. It displays a subversive quality which has always been part of Jewish humor. It is a literature of dialectics and destabilization, and not only a feel-good about the Jew literature that absolves the Germans from their past. Its aim is not a superficial reconciliation. The past always remains present and begs to be acknowledged and dealt with. Therefore, a writer like Oliver Pollack can propose in his book, Ich darf das, ich bin Jude, I'm allowed to do this, I'm a Jew, the following tongue-in-cheek deal to the German reader. I'm translating. Let us disregard this embarrassing story, which is already over 60 years old. Let's make a deal for the duration of your reading this book. I will forget the thing with the Holocaust, and you will forgive us Michel Friedman. Do you all know who Michel Friedman is? He is a pretty prominent and highly controversial German Jewish activist, TV presenter, who is always stepping on German toes and sensibilities, but is unfortunately also involved in many unsavory personal scandals. From their newly established position of self-empowerment, these young Jewish writers open the dialogue with the Germans on the writer's own terms and establish themselves as equals. They transcend the narratives and politics of the victim in the name of equality, solidarity, and universal humanity, and aim to dissolve the tensions between the groups. They offer to establish new, relaxed relations between Germans and Jews. Of course, whether this new Jewish humorist literature will achieve its goal of a more normal German-Jewish relationship is still in question. Michael Wolliger provides us with a measuring stick for possible progress in German-Jewish relations. I quote, "The German-Jewish relationship will be normal on that day when somebody meets a Jewish asshole and proclaims afterwards, 'What an asshole,' and not, 'What a typical Jewish asshole.'" Wolliger is convinced that it will still take quite a while until this is achieved. In conclusion, one can say that this new humorous depiction of German-Jewish relations releases the Jews from their role as victims and attempts to free the Germans from their fear of their own shadows. Laughter is indeed not the worst beginning with which to open a new dialogue. To paraphrase Walter Benjamin in his essay about Karl Kraus, the vibrations of the diaphragm through laughter are a better way to initiate thinking than the stirring of the soul. Thank you.